I'm going to play you a few little pieces of music as I go along. What was really interesting for me about the last talk, and continuing this discussion of Mark Rothko, I read this really awesome book last year called Why People Understand Rothko But Not Stockhausen. Do any of you guys know who Stockhausen is? Karl-Heinz Stockhausen was a sort of avant-garde composer in the sort of mid to late 20th century. Most of his good work was done in like the 50s and 60s. And he really turned the sort of Western canon of music on its head and experimented with a whole lot of sort of electronics early on. He was one of the first guys to start using analog synthesis. He did all sorts of stuff with aleatoric composition, using a whole lot of sort of different mathematics to create musical works. And the author of the book points to this like sort of really interesting phenomenon, which is that even a relatively mainstream audience can go to like, you know, a contemporary art gallery and they can look at some abstract art or even some sort of conceptual installation art and they kind of get it. We have a much sort of larger capacity to work with abstraction and provocation in visual media than we do with sound media. There's something very unsettling about experimental music, about avant-garde music. And this has always fascinated me. So I'm a sound artist. I make a lot of electronic music. And in recent years, I've become very fascinated with the idea of sort of using unusual methodologies to compose. So when I started composing, I used very sort of conventional technologies and very conventional assumptions about what music is. Very conventional assumptions about the Western canon, about rhythmic structures, melodic structures, everything else. But I'm very fascinated in translating the same experiences that we get through visual art into an audio medium. You know, in a lot of ways, sort of sound is 50 years behind visual art. How do we create sound art that is up to the challenge of the 21st century? So I was going to do a sort of brief introduction by running through the history of sort of experimental and specifically aleatoric and algorithmic composition, but I don't think there's time for that. It's probably going to last about an hour if I go down that road. So I wanted to just become a little bit more informal and talk about the music that I work with and the techniques that I use to compose with, and then play a couple of excerpts as I go along, just to maybe get a sense of what the possibilities are. So the piece that I played an excerpt from before we started is called The Golden Ratio, and the reason it's called that is because the golden ratio, which is 1.618, is used as the basis for the spatial distribution between the notes and the octaves in the track. So the amount of time it takes between notes and which notes play are determined by a simple mathematical distribution. And it's very simple. I use a piece of software called Super Collider to compose with, and it's basically a programmatic interface, and you write code that generates music for you. And with about 20 lines of code, you can write that because the mathematics are so simple, but leads to a result that I think is quite interesting. And this sort of speaks back then to the sort of fundamental relationship between music and mathematics and aesthetics and mathematics, right? Which is that we can describe in very simple algorithmic terms a lot of the stuff that we take for granted as being very aesthetically complex in the world. You know, for instance, if we look at the Western canon and we think about how it's divided up into a certain amount of keys and a certain amount of notes per octave and everything else, it's very simple to write software that reproduces pieces from the Western canon that sound like they were composed by someone who understands the basics, the rudiments of Western music. So even with very simple sort of mathematics, you can create stuff that sounds interesting. But I'm interested in doing sort of slightly more challenging stuff than that. So the other thing I work with a lot is using data, taking data from other domains and translating it into musical structures. So one of the recent pieces I did is called Factory Farm Studies, and what I use for that is data from factory farming. So I looked at the slaughter rates of cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens in slaughterhouses around the world, and I used that as a time basis for composition. I then analyzed the distress calls of different animals in slaughterhouses and quantized that into various musical keys. So if you record the sounds of pigs in distress in slaughterhouses, and you analyze and average the sounds they're making, you end up eventually with a musical key, right? They can be playing in the key of D minor or whatever it is. And I took a whole lot of this kind of data, probably about, for each animal, I took about sort of 20 or 30 pieces of data and then translated it into pieces of music. And what's kind of very interesting about using data as a basis for musical composition is that there's a tension between letting the data speak for itself. So just doing a one-to-one mapping of, there's a data point and it makes a sound. And on the other end of that continuum, using a completely sort of overwrought mechanism to turn the source data into whatever you want it, right? So if I want that source data to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, I can make it do that. But that's not very interesting, and it doesn't have any sort of ethical integrity to the data itself. So there's an interesting sort of artistic tension that comes up there, which is how do you be faithful to the data, to the thing in the world that you're responding to, but also make it aesthetically interesting. So I'm just going to play a little tiny excerpt of sheep. So every note that you hear in this piece is 10 sheep being slaughtered, because sheep are slaughtered globally at a rate of, I think, 17 or 30 or something a second. So bear that in mind as you listen to the piece. So there are so many different sources of data that you can use to generate interesting music. One of the pieces I'm working on now is a percussion piece that, as a source material, uses platinum mining data. So it uses the production volume of platinum mining in South Africa over the last 30 years, and it uses the share price of platinum on global markets over the last 20 years, and it uses strike data. There's an amazing collection of strike data. Who would have known that? And all those things intersect to produce sort of complex polyrhythmic structures. And while there's not any sort of direct relationship between what you hear in those kinds of pieces and the data itself, it's not like you can listen to it and go, okay, I understand what it's signifying. I still like to think that there's a sort of indirect affective relationship that connotes some sort of sense of the sort of experiential dynamics of the source data. So one of the other things that I like playing with, besides data, is transforming pieces of music and posing sort of difficult questions about things like copyright. So I extracted the sort of musical data from a bunch of sort of well-known contemporary music, Messiaen, Philip Glass, Steve Reich, things like that. And then I used sort of different techniques like genetic algorithms and stuff to mutate them and transform them into each other. So, for instance, I would take two Philip Glass pieces, and I'll play you a little bit of that now, and evolve the Philip Glass pieces into each other, where the timing of the one glass piece translates into the timing of the other, the melodic structure of the one translates into the melodic structure of the other, and they mutate and evolve and become sort of hybridized thing where if you listen to the music, if you know Philip Glass, then there's some sort of sense of familiarity, but it's you can't quite put your finger on it. It's not really Philip Glass. it's not quite something else either. And for me, that poses like sort of fun artistic questions around, well, what is it? You know, is it Philip Glass? Is it piracy? Is it caricature? Is it something new? Is it a variation? Is it a model? Is it a copy? Is it a simulation? And there's all these kinds of, it exists in a kind of strange liminal space where it's not quite clear what it is.
So what is it?
So, yeah, I don't know if any of you guys listen to Philip Glass, but that is two Philip Glass tracks, Mad Rush and An Opening, two of like his most wonderful pieces, but they've been mutated into each other. So if you listen to the whole piece, there's a sort of vague familiarity, but it's really not Philip Glass. So, I mean, if I release this on CD, what would happen? Is it copyrighted? Is it someone else's work? Is it my work? Whose work is it? I like asking these kinds of questions. And then the one other thing I've been working on at the moment, I cut records. So I have a little machine at home that allows me to cut vinyl in very small runs. I can cut like one record at a time. So with the music that I release, I've decided to sort of completely kick against this idea that music is necessarily a mass commodity and that when you release something in a format, so I mean, if you paint a painting, there's one painting, it's not a mass-produced item. If you release a piece of music, it's necessarily on some sort of format where there's tens of thousands of them in CD warehouse, and for me, that's kind of boring. So I really like the idea of creating these sort of unique artifacts. So what I do when I release music, when I cut a record, is I'll vary the composition each time I cut it. So if I decide I want to release 50 copies of something, I'll decide on some way in which the algorithm generates 50 unique variations on that piece of music, so that each copy of that record is a unique item, which means that only one person is ever hearing that variation of that track, of that composition. And for me, that asks very interesting philosophical questions as well, about this sort of difference between the one and the multiple. Is it one track that I've released 50 variations on? Is it 50 different tracks? Or is it neither one or multiple? Is it something else? Do we need a different sort of philosophical or ontological framework to think about these things? So for me, I find this idea very fun as well. And the most sort of recent thing I've been working on with sort of unique vinyl releases is I've been asking people to send me images of their eyes, and then I use a bunch of sort of algorithmic transformations to extract sort of salient data from people's eyes, the color of their eyes, the size of their pupils, how many flecks they have around their irises, how many sort of red veins they have. There's about 12 or 15 pieces of data that I extract from each eye, and then I turn that into a composition for that person who's commissioned it, and they get their sort of unique record with the sound of their eye on it. And, again, is it so if like 30 or 40 people have a copy of this, is it one track? Is it multiple compositions? I enjoy the fact that there's no sort of direct framework to sort of think about these things, and it sort of forces us to pose different questions around copy and original and things like that. That's about it. But I wanted to be shameless and also say that I actually have some records here of my stuff. So if any of you are interested, you can come speak to me just now, and I'll show them to you. And if you want to buy them, you're welcome to buy them too. And that's it.
Thank you.